Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar today. So we are talking about safety today and safety emergency plans, emergency response plans. So thank you for attending. We have an amazing group. It is great to see so many names. I just want to thank you all for being here, and thank you for being members of America Outdoors, supporting our organization so that we can provide resources like this for you. This will be the last webinar in our fall series. So next up is our conference. We will be, in like a month, December 5th through the 8th, we will be at the Phoenix Convention Center for a big conference and expo. I would love to personally invite all of you to attend. I see some of the names are already registered to come, so I can't wait to talk to you in person when we get there. But if you haven't checked it out or you haven't registered, please go to americaoutdoors.org and at least look at what the content is, look at what the event is all about, and get yourself engaged and see if there's interest there. In addition to the conference, we do at the beginning have the Wilderness First Aid recertification if anyone is interested in that as well. So with that being said, thank you. I'm grateful to have you all. I am going to introduce Dave Dennis. He is Cornerstone Safety Group. He comes highly recommended from some of our members, and so he has volunteered his time to be here with us today to help you work on your crisis response plans. I am going to let him take over the conversation, but I am also going to put up at the same time just a few questions to kind of get us started. Dave has asked us to answer just a couple questions as we go. So Dave, I will hand that over to you, and then I am going to also put up 4 different questions for you all to answer.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen. And great to be here. Nice to re-engage with the America Outdoors. The last I had engaged fully, I was a solo consultant back in 2013 was the last conference I actually attended, and have been on a wonderful journey over the last decade, both building out Cornerstone Safety Group, which I'll speak to in a moment, and working within organizations. So I thought it was appropriate to start with how I kind of got into this line of work. So I was a leader in the field for adventure camping and hiking tours back in the late 1900s, as I like to say. That just led me, as so many of you could probably relate, just led me on this path in terms of working within operations. I was escalated and just kind of committed to this organization and this business. Found my way getting into emergency and risk management purely by default. Nothing I ever intended to do. Started off just being the person that answered the 24/7 emergency line because we were in overnight programs and so forth. That led to a big event. My first kind of activation of a crisis response team was a rollover accident in 2006, and it really opened up my eyes to the crisis response team, the planning, how organizations needed to function at that point. Fast forward, I then got a master's degree, seeing the need, still staying committed to this industry. And where I'm at right now, the work that I do with Cornerstone Safety Group is I'm co-founder and executive director, but we supply comprehensive risk management services to program and excursion providers. And comprehensive to us means that we involve risk management expertise, but we also have mental health and medical experts on our team. We have 2 medical directors and 2 one therapist and 1 psychologist on our team as well. So we round out that whole risk management spectrum. Let me see. I wanted to share my screen here, but I don't see that I have capabilities while these polls are up here. Karen, if you wouldn't mind helping me out with that, or letting me know if you see my screen here.
I think we have to wait until the polls close.
Got it. Okay.
So we have 2 questions done.
Okay, great.
Do you want to just hold for just 2 minutes and we'll get these last couple questions?
Yeah.
The one thing that I actually forgot to mention, as we talked earlier, I forgot to invite everyone for conversation. I think Dave, you had asked that if people do have questions, if they would like to unmute and ask questions, or if you would like to type your questions in the question box for later, just so that we kind of open up that engagement if anyone really has anything they want to add or ask.
That's great. Yes, this is a heavy topic, clearly, if we're just talking about emergency and crisis planning and what that looks like. So the more conversation that we can have, the less I'm talking at people, but with people and answering questions. I really would like to make this about you and your needs. Granted, we only have an hour, so there's going to be a little bit of scratching the surface, but the more we can customize that and get it in front of you would be wonderful.
Okay, I'm going to put up one final question.
Okay,
so
great.
It's taken everyone just about 45 seconds to answer each one. And thank you all, because I'm getting like 90% response.
Perfect.
So thanks.
Active group. I love it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that was quick. That was the yes or no. So
Love it.
It should be all you.
Okay. Fantastic. So here we are talking about response planning and emergency planning, however you might frame it within your organization. And really, I wanted to focus on three buckets today. And the first is all around, what does the response team structure need to look like? And some of you may be familiar with the incident command system and what that looks like within search and rescue, or if you work with National Park Service or BLM land or any of those things as well. And I have adopted the ICS structure and really adapted it to our industry specifically. So I want to talk about the team structure. I then want to talk about the actual plan and what does the plan core components look like? What are some of the initial early actions as well? And then we'll round out by talking about training and implementation. And this I see as really the three stages of approaching a crisis and emergency risk plan. Now, again, lots to throw at you here. Everybody will have a copy of this slide deck, so don't feel like you need to take down the actual bullet points. Just want to focus on that. But first, I want to start off with a little bit of a scenario. And you all receive a phone call in your personal lives. And the phone call goes something along the lines of, "Hi, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. This is Dave Dennis with Cornerstone Safety Group. You are listed as an emergency contact for Jade, who is with our group. I'm calling with an important update regarding her trip at Lake Powell. Are you able to talk right now? Okay, thanks. I just received word from our team that Jade was involved in an accident while snorkeling this afternoon. What I know is that she was snorkeling with her group, and at one point, she went underwater and became unresponsive. She was brought to the surface, given CPR, and regained a pulse. Jade was rushed to shore and is en route to Page Medical Center. She's stable, but still in a critical state. Her guide is still with her, but I don't know much more. I'd like to get you to Paige as soon as possible." The reason I share this and started is that is an example of a phone call and based on an actual situation that I was involved in 2015. And the situation was based on a company that I worked with that ran trips globally. And this group was in Fiji. And Jade was a 24-year-old chaperone who was actually leading her school group, a Chinese private school group, in and around a water-based program. And she did submerge underwater, was found unresponsive, and was, as I had mentioned in that initial phone call, pulled alongside onto a boat, given CPR, and resuscitated. Now, I happened to be in Singapore at the time doing work with a different organization, and I got called because I was in charge of global risk and safety for this organization. I immediately flew from Singapore over to the Gold Coast of Australia because once Jade was brought into the emergency care there within Fiji, it was evaluated and she needed to fly over to the Gold Coast. So while we were organizing, the response team was organizing that emergency evacuation, I was focused on being a traveling responder and going to the Gold Coast to meet our team that was there, but also her parents that were arriving on site. When I arrived, so it took about a day and a half for me to actually get there, maybe 24 hours roughly. Jade was already in the intensive care unit, and she spent 7 days in the emergency care unit before she was moved down on day 8 into a step-down unit. She made a full recovery, which was absolutely amazing. When I got there, she had 3/4 of one lung totally filled with water, and the other one had about a quarter to a third filled with water, and she was on life support system. And I thought, as a traveling responder, I was going to go there by the bedside and help the family understand whether they needed to pull the plug or what were those next steps. Miraculous recovery. It was pretty amazing. The total response effort. So I left on day 8 or day 8.5 to 9. Once they were down on the step down unit, my role as a traveling responder and being there to support the parents, that job was done, but I continued to speak with them as turning into the lead incident command, if you will, at that point. We remained in contact for over 21 days dealing with the immediate needs, and I actually kept in contact with Jade for a couple years after. This is a picture of me by Jade. This is the day after she came off life support. Funny story here is, mom's giving the everything's okay sign. Jade really felt that she was at peace and wanted me to do the peace sign. And affectionately, she saw me as her guardian angel, because when she came out of her medically induced coma, for some reason, I was the first face that she could actually see clearly. So Jade and I created a pretty nice friendship after the point there. I share this not only to kind of settle us into our seats and understand what's going on, but I have been part of an emergency response team. I've been activated about 7 or 8 times in playing some role of an active response team. Unfortunately, I've gone through 2 tragedies, and this was the third that I thought was going to be the tragedy that actually had a wonderful outcome, as I articulated. So first, what do we think about when we're designing crisis or emergency plans? And I wanted to put a little context here that there's really 3 buckets of incidents or accidents that we should be thinking about. The first is the incident that happens, which are the sprained ankles, or those things that commonly happen, whether you're an overnight program, a day excursion, rafting trip, and so forth. We're commonly used to those, and we have field protocols in place to manage those events. Emergencies are urgent and life-threatening situations that jeopardize the well-being of our clients or participants, whatever you might happen to call them. These require this escalation, this comprehensive response, but they're manageable within organizations if we have the right practices and roles and responsibilities put in place. The way the definition actually speaks is the crisis is something that overwhelms the organization. It can be a turning point to our ability to function or the collapse of our organization. So while the terms crisis and emergency are interchangeable, and that's fine, I really want us to be in the mindset that we want to move out of that unbearable, untenable situation into something that is in the emergency bracket and something that is more manageable. So as I had mentioned, I'm a big fan of the incident command system. And why I'm a big fan of this command system is it was developed by first responders, and it really buckets our roles and responsibilities of what needs to happen when we're dealing with large scale or significant events. At the top here, you're looking at incident command, and this is somebody who is not tied into the weeds as much as possible in terms of the response, but they're really the puppeteer, as I like to say, and make sure that all the functions are working independently while there is some overlap and alignment, of course, but there's a team tasked with each of these responsibilities, whether it's the field response of operations, whether it's around communications, and I'll touch on this point several times today. What happens logistics? Logistics could be a rescue vehicle. It could be aligning, we have family members coming on site. We need to get hotel accommodations and pick them up at the airport and those things as well. We're all familiar with the logistics involved with our program setup. Finance, obviously, we just have to have money accessible, whether it's cash from the bank that we just front load, or we're connecting in our insurance or workers' comp or any of those things as well. And then in this other bucket, I've added onto is really around the advisors. And what this might look like within your organization is having this incident command, and depending on the size of your organization, I would love to return back to those polling questions just to hear who we might have here, Karen, in a moment. But the incident command, there may be some overlap between this role and also what's happening in the field. And again, that just speaks to the dynamic of your organization. But when we think about working with first responders, maybe sending a traveling responder, when I spoke to that role, when I traveled from Singapore over to the Gold Coast of Australia, that was me being a representative of my organization and meeting the loved ones, the emergency contacts that were arriving on site. All of these are very hands-on, tangible pieces that are happening with the field response, okay? That's its own bucket. Second bucket here is around the communications. I think the most significant, most influential piece of our response is how we're communicating to our various stakeholders. And we're talking about our internal stakeholders. Those are the people involved in the accident, our staff. Who else needs to know about this? Certainly emergency response, search and rescue and so forth. And then who's external, the media, maybe future programs and so forth. Those two buckets have two different level of conversations about what we're sharing, what we're not sharing, and so forth. And that needs to be understood. Logistics, pretty straightforward. Finance, I had mentioned insurance. Again, I would bucket workers' comp in here. How are we getting reimbursed? That could also be your participants and customers if you require, or they have travel insurance. Maybe they're an inbound person from overseas or something. Do they have travel insurance as well for reimbursement? Very important. And then this last bucket here, who are your organization's advisors? That could be legal, that could be consultants like us within, Cornerstone Safety Group when we're actively on call with our members and so forth as well. So all of these actors all feed up this activity into that incident command function as well. Let me pause here. And Karen, have you seen anything come in or any questions up to this point?
I don't have any questions right now.
Okay. Great.
If anyone has any, feel free to raise your hand or type them in the question box too.
Perfect. So when we're thinking about roles, I'm just going to continue on, Karen, so please interrupt me at any point. So we know what the functions look like. We know what we need to be focused on. And again, with these core pieces and response actions. But maybe your organization you are the business owner, or maybe there's one owner, CEO, or so forth. Maybe you have a team within operations, your program director or manager or so forth. Maybe you have a team that answers phones within your office. Maybe you have somebody focused on social media, communications, marketing, and so forth. And you might have somebody internally for accounting. Maybe you outsource that as well. So the accounting advisors, could fall within these buckets. Whoops. So how do we assign these roles? When we're talking about larger organizations, it's easy to say we have a separate operations team, a separate communications team, and so forth. But with smaller organizations, what we're focusing on today is what roles can these people, these limited participants, play within our emergency and our crisis response. This is how I think about a primary role. That incident command is certainly the business owner. This person in this incident command needs to have a broad understanding. I'm a business owner as well, so I know what we're doing within all of our functions. So that allows me to have that great unbiased perspective and make sure that we have alignment with what's going out from our organization. The operations side, certainly we're tied into how do we normally work with National Park Service or BLM or first responders in our area, or what does even our rafting trip, for example, look like, and what are the pull in, pull out points and so forth. The family liaison, this is a communications role. When we think about communication outwardly to families, again, pulling back on that Jade situation, we had people from the office that were communicating updates while I was traveling as a traveling responder on site. And that family liaison is somebody who's laser focused on 1, 2, maybe even 3 families, maybe tied into the event, depending on what the situation may tie to. I usually like to limit this family liaison as much as possible to a set number of families, like 1 to 3 sounds about right. The reason why, when I'm on that other end of the phone call, when I got that call as Mr. Smith from Cornerstone Safety Group, I want to know that every time I pick up the phone call, whether I call them or I receive an inbound phone call, I know where that last moment, that last update was left off at. These family liaisons become the most trusted piece of an emergency response on the communication side as well, right? So I'm spending extra time here because usually when we have customer service people or sales team, they might have a really strong skill set in and around this building trust and building communication and so forth, versus general broad communications, holding statements, social media posts if we need to do that and so forth, might be more aligned with your marketing team because we know how we're reaching and where we're reaching, our stakeholders and those things as well, okay? But not only are we thinking about primary roles, I always want us and want to push, our members and anybody here today to think about secondary roles. Because while I could understand my role as the incident command, I might not be available. I might be sick. I might have a family issue going on. Who knows, whatever else. I might be on an airplane and so forth. So we need to build and deepen the bench within our multiple roles. And this is what it might look like within a smaller organization. Right. So if I'm out of the office, I might turn to my ops people because they may have that general day-to-day knowledge and so forth. Okay. So when we assign roles, I like to think and align them on a couple core pillars, if you will. The first is, how does it relate to their day-to-day function? And you heard me talking about the marketing and the ops team and the communications, customer service, and so forth. I think that just makes sense. When we're comfortable or assigning roles to people on our team that are used to what we're doing on a day-to-day basis and what that might relate to from a response standpoint, that helps a lot. But our people also should have some level of interest in the role. Where I've seen things go a little sideways is just because somebody works in marketing, for example, we thrust them into the communication role, and that might not be a great fit when we're thinking about this human safety and our response roles as well. So how do we gain that interest, or what is their interest in the response role? And I'll speak to that in a little bit as well. Thinking about personality and strengths, we might have people within our ops team or might have people within our sales team that are just generally extroverts, or their parents themselves, so they can put themselves in that family liaison type of role as well. So while it might not align per se with their day-to-day function, if you have somebody on your team that has a very strong skill set that might align within that ICS structure, I think that's something to pay attention to as well. And I added this last piece around single points of failure. A single point of failure is obviously if something's missing, the whole system collapses. So just like you're in the backcountry, if we don't have access to our cell phone or our sat phone, how are we going to communicate out in the field, right? Or if there's gaps within our rafting route where we know we don't have cell connectivity and something happens at that point, what are we doing to build that redundancy so we don't create these single points of failure? And I highlight that because these roles are really important to think about when we're working with a smaller team and so forth. Okay. So that's assigning roles, and I want to pause here before I move on to the actual plan itself. Any questions, Karen, that have come in yet? And we're happy to keep these to the end if that's easier.
Yeah, the only question I got so far was if the slides would be available afterwards.
Absolutely, 100%. I want everybody to have all this information, so you will have this as a
Awesome.
PDF.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So we talked about our team, and again, let me just reinforce the core functions that we're working towards, very important. Last thing I'll say on this before moving on to the actual plan, when we're not dealing with a crisis, when we're not dealing with an emergency, something on that huge level, but we're managing minor and lower level events, we're doing these same functions, which is great. We have somebody, maybe your ops manager, who's managing somebody has a broken leg. How are we evacuating them? How are we communicating with families and so forth? All we're doing when we think about developing a crisis and emergency response plan is we're pulling those functions out that we do on a normal day-to-day basis, and we're giving them their own category or their own bucket. So, I think that's just really important to understand when we're thinking about functionality and so forth. All right. So now, what does an actual plan look like? And I brought my show and tell binder here as well. In my mind, and the way I have developed plans, both as part of my master's degree back in 2010, and what I have done ever since, is there's core functions or sections within a crisis response plan that need to be included. I want to be very clear that it's easy to develop a plan. We feel good about it. We put it on the bookshelf. We've all heard of these things, collecting dust and so forth. And I think that's a very real, place to consider, or piece to consider as well. Second piece is around what organizations look like today are very different than what they may have looked like pre-COVID. Right. And I know that I hate to bring up any and all of our trauma relating to pre-pandemic and where we are today. But if you're relying on a local partner, if you're relying on somebody else to help fulfill pieces of your program and the delivery of your program, if that's appropriate, having that conversation about what their crisis team looks like, I think is very important. All right, bring it back to this actual plan. So first page, I always like to have in the front of my actual binder is the initial actions. And I'll speak to that in the next slide, I believe. So How do we get to the initial actions when somebody calls in on that emergency phone? What information are we gathering and so forth? I've lived a scenario where you hang up that phone and you don't have the exact phone number, or you didn't get all the information, and then that just delays those initial steps. So if we have a guideline, and somebody like myself who's been in this industry for close to 30 years and have managed tens of thousands of incidents, I always have stumbling blocks as well. So I use these checklists. They're very important. Number two, how do we activate the crisis response team, and what does that look like? Number three, response roles and checklists. I have examples of both of those pieces that I will show in the following slides here. Section three, again, communication in my mind is just so important. So what kind of media statements are we thinking about? Do you have a holding statement that is templated that you can plug and play with information and get it out there? There's nothing worse within the communications function, and something happens with on your program, your trip, excursion, and so forth, and you have an empty Google sheet and you're supposed to draft up during high emotions, high intensity, draft up these type of plans. So writing up media statements, using communication templates. If you've been through high water of your rafting trip, if you've been through a trip adjustment and you've had to make accommodations for X, Y, and Z, pull those emails out, look at them critically, and how can you create what you've already communicated as an organization and create a template out of that? While it might not be exact to the specific situation that you're dealing with, at least it's going to give you something to work from. So you know what is in the initial section, what's the body, and then what's the end, and we want to keep them as concise as possible. So create those communication templates as well. Communication tracker, simply we're looking around what information goes out, what is the timestamp, what is a link to that Google Doc, what did we post on Instagram, and so forth. We want to make sure we're tracking our external communications, but we also want to track the phone calls that we're getting. Are they family and loved ones? Are they the media? Are they just people kind of curious? Are they from the national park, and so forth? So how do you track that information so you're actually able to see and log and timestamp that information as well? And the last piece, which is unfortunately near and dear to my heart, is how do we deliver severe injury or death notifications as an owner or a C-suite, level, or a leader within your organization? I highlight this one because unfortunately I had to give a death notification last summer. We had one of our members who had a staff member tragically pass away, and I was on the phone with the business owner themselves and notified their next of kin, their emergency contact as well. The point I'm getting at with all of this communication structure here, when we're not under duress and we're able to think about as hard and sad and as much as we don't want these things to happen, I want to reinforce the importance of creating these documents that we can pull from while we're not in that moment of intensity and crisis as well. All right, moving on, section 4. Field protocols, I always like to put those in there. You may have them as a separate operating and staff manual and so forth, but if you have a separate crisis response plan, drop those in there so everything is in one document as well. You don't have to go searching for it. I think simplicity is definitely the key here. Same with your forms. If you have a witness statement, an accident report, any of those other things, incident report and so forth, if you can link those into this crisis manual, what we're trying to do is, again, under duress, make things as simple as possible and all contained in this as well. What you will see in my physical copy, and I highlight this because many of you might be working out of a brick and mortar location, I always create these tabs that are these sections. Right? You may even have sub tabs that are an incident command, response, checklist, and so forth. We'll go through that as well. Initial actions, I feel like this is probably a lot of review for many of you, but we want to capture the who, what, when, where. We don't really necessarily care as much about how. That's really important, of course. We want to know how something happened, but not necessarily on the first call if it's not relevant. The why piece, we'll get to that. That's more so into the investigation and follow-up place as well. So who's calling in the incident, what happened, where did it happen, and when did it happen? Date and time, of course, and who else is involved. I highlight the injured and non-injured because it's so easy to manage or focus on who's injured and what's happening there, and then we forget what might be happening with the rest of the group, right? And we don't want somebody wandering off if we're dealing with a vehicle accident and so forth. Where are everybody, in and around this place? We don't want them separating themselves and creating a secondary situation as well. And then have you contacted emergency services? If not, let's get them on the phone if that's needed and so forth. I always like to also finish the call. What else do I need to know currently? And what do you need right now, right? What do I need to know? Is there anything that we might not have missed? What do you need immediately? Okay, that's great. The last thing I'll say is before hanging up the call, always repeat the phone number of that person and contact information coming in. Okay, you may say, hey, don't worry, I have my staff phone number. Maybe something happened to their cell phone and they're using one of your participants or clients or something along those lines as well. Always get the information number or information details, and then repeat the number back before you hang up, okay? Seems like a lot to gather. I get all of that, but that's what we want to do, okay? Again, all of that is on the front cover of my incident response plan. Step 2, I received this inbound call. I now want to reach out to Karen, who's on my emergency response team, and I get a hold of Karen, okay? I am the initial contact within the organization, so I own that. Once I contact Karen, I need to go back and focus on what's happening. I need a customer or a traveler list. Maybe I pull a manifest. Maybe we have the emergency contact. Maybe I pull a logistical itinerary and so forth. I need to compile as the initial responder all of the information so I have it available. Karen's role is going to be activating the rest of the emergency response team. I can't worry about calling and activating the team because, again, as you can hear from the urgency, I want to be able to focus on what's happening there. And then we all regroup, ideally through Zoom. If you're in an office, that's great, or whatnot. But once this team is activated, we all regroup, I report out, and then we get to the next step, which is assigning roles and so forth. If you don't have an emergency contact list, here's just an example. I like to use multiple means of contact and establish that. Maybe you have a Slack or a WhatsApp within your group, or something along those lines. I love creating a WhatsApp group, if that seems familiar and useful for your team, that's specifically labeled for a crisis or an emergency response team. And then when we assign roles, we talked about the physical or the tangible piece about assigning roles and responsibilities. But this step, once we have information, we regroup, often gets delayed because nobody really knows I'm doing what or whatnot. So it's important for incident command, whoever you are, to really focus on assigning those roles if your team is a bit hesitant or unclear on which role, because we talked about primary, secondary, and so forth. Get those roles assigned, and then start acting. I want to focus on human safety because this relates to legal potential and how people feel, at the end and so forth. But we always want to focus on human safety first, containing that incident so it doesn't create secondary issues or cascade to other parts of our organization. We want to be able to function the rest of our programs if they're unrelated. And then obviously we want to think about financial reputational impacts. However, if we put financial protection as our primary focus, that's going to come out whether it's immediately or as the situation evolves. So I really like to be an advocate of focusing on these three or these four in a stage approach. Rely on roles and checklists. Response roles are very different than our field protocols. When we think about how are we managing our response team is very different than how do we manage a flipped raft or a broken leg or so forth. And then I always advocate, let's talk to your first responders. If you have people in the areas where you're delivering programs and you have not yet shared what your emergency plan looks like, please do so. I think this is the last piece here on the actual roles and checklists. This is an example of how I have designed an incident command checklist. What you'll notice here is they're very open in terms of not being very specific to a type of incident because we need to be flexible. So here it's around activating the team, bring us together and share information, establish our roles and responsibilities, create a cycle of when we're doing our check-ins, usually very quickly in the beginning, and then it will cascade outwardly and so forth. And then you'll see level 7 here, do we need to send somebody on site as a traveling responder and so forth. This list is about 15 steps of initial actions, and then after 24 hours, which is usually when things settle and take on a different sense of urgency, that might be a separate list as well. And then utilizing support resources. When I think about small business and who's available on your team, who else is in and around your space, who locally can go quickly to the scene as soon as possible? Are they tied to your organization? Maybe they were a past leader or a guide and so forth. Sometimes we just need to throw bodies that can be there and support people. Anything relating to your organization can be escalated question-wise or so forth up to your organization, but sometimes we just need to rely on those people. So my intent around this slide is just think broadly and not just so narrowly of who is directly on your staff. How can you rely on other people like your legal, your insurance, your consultants, your first responders, and so forth. I mentioned communications. I believe in and have a lot of anecdotal and conversational investment in this and evidence from legal teams, but most lawsuits are based on a result of feeling misinformed, abandoned, or essentially not cared for as situations happen. When the perception, the reason I started this session with that initial phone call is because I want to have an underlying tone that it's great to think about what we're doing as an organization outwardly, but we really need to focus on how it's being heard, specifically with those that are directly impacted from this situation. So that's why we talk about stakeholder groups and how we're communicating to our internal teams and external teams who might be within those groups and need to have information. I talked a little bit about types of holding statements and ongoing updates. These are very different types of communications, but just creating those type of templates based on what's happened in the past is just so significant. And whenever I review and work on these type of plans, it's amazing how much organizations go through and have inherent knowledge, but haven't actually used those as templates before. And I talked about tracking all communications as well. Really, it's all around getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. When we're dealing with crises, we want to feel like we have all the information before we share it. I always like to communicate within 2 hours, dare I say 1 hour. When we know that there's a life-threatening situation, I know we want to have the information before we share it with loved ones, but our duty of care is to communicate and say, I don't have all the answers, but this is what I know. I need to communicate with you as clearly as possible, as soon as possible, and then I will keep you updated. That's where these relationships go very well, versus when we wait 3, 4, 5 hours, something along those lines, we wait till we have information. If that goes to a lawsuit, that timetable comes to the surface very quickly, and then it just is perceived that your organization was more focused on business protection than it was communicating what's happening to a loved one or so forth. So we prepare for scenarios, we role play before conversations. When I had that death notification last year, the owner and I role played together, and here's what I'm going to say, here's what you're going to say, how does this sound and whatnot. It took about 5 or 10 minutes. Then we paused for about 2 minutes, took a deep breath, and jumped on that phone. We need practice saying the words. When I worked within an organization, I would always make my CEO once a year call an actor in a scenario that we would run and tell them that there's been a tragedy with their loved ones. It's hard as hell, and I know all of that, but we don't want the first time we're speaking words of significance when we're actually on phone with those people. I did a lot of talking there, Karen. How are we doing on questions so far?
You're doing great job. There's lots of talking, but it's awesome. I think people are taking it in. We don't have questions yet. Again, feel free. Oh wait, someone is typing one right now. Do you have specific people slated into roles pre-crisis and adapt if needed, or are you doing all role assigning in the moment?
That's a great segue to what I want to speak to next. So let me just carry that forward. The simple answer is absolutely designating these people, making sure they're informed and comfortable in their role, and then we're building out that primary, secondary, and so forth, right? So what do I mean by all of this? And great segue. Whoever said that, a gold star for you. 3 phases, and you may find yourself and your organization in one of these. So please deal with me in what this looks like. But what I think it's helpful is If you have new staff coming in to your organization, maybe they need to be introduced to the plan. So maybe even though you might have a well-mature team that knows what they're doing, you may have new players coming in, even seasonally, for example. So number one, introduce their response role. This is what we're relying on. This is how it fits within the broader picture. This is why you are a designated person, or why we feel it's important that you have a role in all of this. And just share with them the broader picture, and then give them time to review your crisis plan and come to you with questions. I can't stress it enough. We want trust, confidence, and honesty within our response team for a couple reasons. Number one, we're vulnerable as humans. I've been doing this work a long time. I still make missteps. It's okay. We need to have that kind of trust and respect for each other, number one. Number two, I may be going through a personal situation with my family, and personally, I may be, emotionally challenged and so forth, where I have to say, I can't call that family. I can't deliver this news. I feel like I'm better in the logistics role, where I'm more in the background because I have things going on in my life. We need to create this to the best extent possible, where our team is able to say, I feel more suited here, or something along those lines. Now, I'm not saying that's an excuse to just say, I don't want to be involved and so forth. But what I hope you're hearing from this is, if we trust each other, we're honest and open and sometimes vulnerable with each other, specifically within this team, that's where I've seen these teams really come together and bring a lot of strength. Once we introduce, we give them a chance to ask questions about the plan, then we start doing our training. Our training, I like to pull out our communications function and focus on, okay, let's use a aligned scenario through all of the different functions. Maybe it's a rollover accident, just stay with me. And at this point, you are assigned as a communications coordinator or whatever, you're in charge of communications. What are you doing at this stage versus this stage versus this stage, right? It's calm. It's like, this feels important to me. We want to use that as a scenario and this level of training. It gives us a chance to talk about, what is our messaging in this example, want to focus on what feels right when we talk about those templates and so forth. And ask what felt off when we ran through that, training. What else do you need? Well, I think we need more templates. I think I need more training. If I'm a spokesperson for the organization, I really feel like I'm going to freeze up in front of a camera. Let's focus in on that as well. Okay. I put in the bottom here, everyone in your organization needs some level of training. And this is pulled specifically from the first incident I dealt with, wow, long time ago, where I was part of a response team, but I was based in headquarters on a remote satellite base. And I was managing the event with the rest of the crisis response team, and somebody outside my office who was in customer service overheard what was going on. They received an inbound call and somebody said, hey, I'm a cousin of the person. I've heard there's been an accident. Can you tell me what's going on? My customer service person felt they were doing a really good thing by sharing the details as they overheard of what was going on. Well, that person who called was actually the media. And now we had a secondary incident where we had a PR issue with not clear information. We were already communicating to families and so forth. You can hear where I'm going and see where I'm going with that. When we have an incident go on within the team and we're thinking about communicating internally, it's worth a quick note if you're not all in the same office. Hey, we have a situation going on. If anybody calls in, just let them know. We'll call them back within a 30-minute period, take their contact information. We're focusing on the scene and we're communicating with those directly impacted, period. Some level of alertness and awareness, and give them instructions of where to redirect. Because we all want to do what feels good for the right reasons when we get those inbound calls, but sometimes there can be, sideways calls come our way, and it's just part of the reality that we're dealing with, okay? So that's why I reinforce this, that even people that work the front office, if they're not part of your response team, they need to know what this looks like. A, we have a plan. B, we're training it. And C, here's your role in case somebody has that inbound call or so forth. Sorry, I went down a wormhole there. Third part of this, once everybody has been assigned, they understand their roles, we've gone through a level of this simplified training and so forth, now it's time to flex these muscles and practice. I like to run 2 exercises per year, but you can do it annually as well. And sometimes, you just need it annually, especially if your team is already trained and you haven't lost any of that staff, that's great. The 3 phases, and you think about it as graduating kind of exercises. The first is a planned tabletop. Karen, you and I and the rest of our response team are coming together on August 5th. We're going to exercise our roles. We're going to do a 60-minute, maybe a 90-minute simulation. It's only us in the room, and it's going to be designed on an escalating situation that's just delivered by handouts or online or something along those lines as well. Very, very controlled. The idea here is let's see how everybody responds to an incident. Let's see how the roles play together and overlap. And that brings a lot of clarity. And I always like to schedule about 30 minutes to 60 minutes afterwards to do an immediate debrief. So if you have 2 hours designated during a slow period, run a 60-minute exercise. If you need help, that's the kind of work that we do. But your insurance company, your broker can also support this, and there's others, out there in the space as well. Work through this, get the general flow, debrief afterwards, and figure out where do we push the seams, what did we totally overlook, and so forth. Next is announced simulation. You don't know what's going on. It's going to happen on August 5th. You need 2 hours. That's all you need to know. They don't know whether it's their primary, secondary role. There's no idea on the scenario and so forth. And that's just delivered ideally by an external party or maybe somebody on your team that's not directly involved as a responder and so forth. Phase one of this is just doing it internally to catch people maybe at home, driving their car or whatever. I get to be a little sneaky and maybe a little evil in that way, but we just want to start pushing the seams to figure out when are the most vulnerable points within our organization if we were to get this call, if that's appropriate. First, do it internally. Next, you may want to involve the park service, your local responders, or so forth. Maybe they have bandwidth, maybe they don't. Maybe you have external actors that are coming into this place, as well. Okay. So phase one versus phase two, the announced simulation, and of course the last one, unannounced. Nobody knows when it's happening, and we just call in, and then we just respond as we normally would. These are the phases of, in a perfect world, blue sky idea, how we practice in and around our roles, responsibilities, and so forth. So I'm going to quit talking here and field any questions. What I want to leave you with is think about your plan and where are you within these various life cycles with your team? Have you had a turnover on your team? Do you have an established plan, but it is admittedly collecting dust? Do you have the templates? Is there things that we can add in there, that notification of a severe injury and so forth? Are all your players that you're going to rely on familiar with what that looks like? And then discuss scenarios, run exercises. I love spending time at the end of every peak season, talk about what happened, let's look at trends and so forth, but let's really dive into those case studies, those events that made me feel very uncomfortable, or I thought that maybe we didn't manage correctly, or maybe it was a near miss and it could have gone sideways if something else had happened. Love those, discuss those with your team, and that's how we continually build on the skill set and expertise. Because as I mentioned, I've been doing this work for quite a while, but I'm always surprised with the type of events and situations that come up. That's what I had for you all today.
All right, Dave, can I throw another question at you?
Love it, please. Yes.
So we've talked a lot about crisis, but how or does this vary at all if you're looking at more of a mid-level emergency? Would you use the same plan?
You would use the same model in terms of a mid-level event where somebody's going to the hospital, but they're not life-threatening, but they're going to the hospital. We need to know operationally how to get them there. We know that we need to communicate with emergency contact, loved ones, and so forth. We know that there might be some logistical challenges, right? That we might have an adjustment of our itinerary, or the rest of the group has to get back to our rafting office and so forth. I think what we can learn and model on mid-level events is the core functions of the incident command system and how we're managing that, and think about it with less players or something, because we need that logistics, that communication, the financial coverage. We need all of those functions to manage every level of situation, whether it's minor or most significant. Did that make sense? And was that clear, Karen?
Yeah, I think so. I think that,
okay.
Yes. Unless anyone has any further questions. Rest of the group, what questions do you have? This was a great presentation, lots of information to take in.
Lots to take in for
Um,
sure.
Okay, most common mistakes or issues you see when evaluating a response.
Yep. The first is that delay around and having clarity on what role do I have. So it's that initial hour to two on the onset of that inbound call is the most confusing part of any response because the facts are going to change between the first, second, and third inbound call in a crisis. So gaining that clarity can be difficult, right? Because we want clarity before we then assign roles. I always like to over respond and then we can downplay as we go. So that's number one, is just clarity of what's going on, and assigning roles. The second piece is not putting forth the who do we need to communicate, who needs to know that something's going on, right? And again, it just highlighted that communication piece for me, and what is our role in focusing on that level of transparency and vulnerability.
Awesome. What are your recommendations for small organizations with 1 to 2 owners or managers? And those 1 to 2 people have to have multiple roles. Is it
Yep.
okay for one person to do 3 or 4 things?
Yeah, I think out of necessity, yes. I mean, we have to take that. But what I think we can do, so what I would love to speak to is more more intent around the communications, the templates, like all of those things that we can just line up to make those response roles easy. Number one. Number two, talk through some of these scenarios. We had a mid-level event or even a minor event. What would that look like, and how could it play out if we had, other resources and so forth? Small plug, and I'm sorry for that, but in Cornerstone, we work with a lot of organizations with small structures, right? And we are that extension on the response and on call and those things as well. So members have found value in that, but I'm not here to plug Cornerstone by any means. But maybe you have own people in your own life that you can get consultants on retainer, or talk to your insurance companies how they can help with these type of things as well. So that's what I mean. Think broadly about who's on your team and in and around your space that you might be able to rely on.
Are there any potential liabilities for not having an external review of your crisis response plan?
I don't think there's legal vulnerability there. It's good to have a different set of eyes on it. When I was head of safety for organizations, I didn't have it externally audited because we were running so many exercises. We were able to see where gaps were, and we had those other case studies to rely on to think about what does that look like. So if you have the internal knowledge, fantastic. If it's just something that is a legacy item and has grown through the organization, there's a lot of value that can come to the surface. What are other organizations doing? How do I know I fall in line with best practice and so forth? But I don't think it's a necessity, nor would it create a legal vulnerability. It's just do you have confidence in that plan? That's what I would lean towards.
Awesome. Hopefully these are answering all your questions too, though. So please feel free to chime in if you
Yep.
have more to add, because I'm just reading these questions.
Yeah.
Should people do an interview during a crisis response?
Yes, those witness statements are real, both from staff and people that were physically on site as well. I also like to interview my response team after the event when the dust is settled. Now, I think timing is key with this because, again, we want to lean towards that human compassion standpoint. So we're not interviewing people while we're in the active response mode. I think 24, 36 hours feels right. When I was brought on to my first tragedy, we kept the group together. We were there for several days before people went home, some were in the hospital and so forth. So we just decided what was the right time. Once they felt comfortable in contacting loved ones and felt stable enough, given the situation, then it felt right in terms of, can you give us information? Obviously we want to document this, but we want to hear it while it's still fresh and so forth. So interviews have a key place. I think timing is just up to situation dependent.
Awesome. Thank you. That is the questions, but I do have a hand up. So let's hear it.
Great.
Aaron, what you got? You are self-muted.
Hey, can you hear me?
Aaron. Yep,
Yeah.
gotcha.
Great. We had to both hit unmute at the same time, I think. But anyway, briefly, I just want to thank you, Dave, for really information-rich presentation. It's giving me a lot to think about, and it seems like it's going to be spot on for a lot of people who are paying attention to this and thinking about how to buff up their risk management strategy and response. And to that, I just wanted to ask a question here around like reporting, right? So if you, I guess, are on the level where you have incidents happening and you're recording those, I would think because you'd want to see a downward trend, right?
Yeah.
Some recommendations around like strategies for reporting. I know some folks like actually try to record near misses and stuff like that. What rises to a level? And I wonder if you could answer that question both for like outfitters who have guides on the scene and like liveries, for example, who might just be, you know, have somebody on the river and they can't directly manage an incident.
Yeah, gotcha. So what I heard in that is more on noticing trends, evaluating data, and so forth, right? Is that the level that you were pointing to, Aaron?
Yeah, that's right.
Great. Yep. What I like to do is I'm a firm believer in color coding green, yellow, red, and whatever that might mean to your organization. You know, give you an example for simplicity's sake. Me, green is managed on site. It's okay. Maybe we take to a hospital visit, but it's only a couple hours, and then there's no overnight. That overnight would be the yellow. We have different levels of maybe supervision, communication, and so forth when somebody's spending an overnight in that medical facility, and red is red. I highlight that because, well, two pieces. Number one, from the incident reporting standpoint, if we can bucket our greens from our yellows to our reds, and we can see a pattern that happens year on year, we can notice trends between riverways or vendors that we utilize or transportation or any of those things as well. Typically, I like to stay within a 5 to 7% range in terms of reported accidents based on the number of travelers we have in a year or a period of time as well. That might be a little nuanced in the type of work I typically work within, you know, so again, rafting companies, climbing companies, so forth might have different margins therein, but that's something that I established for myself. And those patterns and those trends, you know, are really helpful. So that's what I can speak to in terms of the reporting standpoint. The other piece I wanted to speak to with that green, yellow, red model is when somebody from the field calls in and says, hey, I have a green, I have a yellow. If that call gets cut off, we know that there's that level of situation happening versus, hey, this is Dave. Karen, it's great to talk to you. I have this situation going, and then it cuts off. You know, then you're still left wondering, are we dealing with a near miss, a tragedy, or whatever? So I think simplifying and creating those type of keywords I think would be really helpful. It's good for reporting and people at the higher level and noticing trends, but it's also helpful for field response.
That's really insightful. Thank you so much. I'll turn off my mic and turn it back to the organizers. But yeah, once again, thank you for doing this for us.
Of course. Absolutely, Aaron.
Thanks.
Great.
Thanks, Aaron. Dave, thank you.
Yes.
Does anyone have any other questions? Otherwise, I want to be mindful of time and wrap up. And I don't see any other hands. I don't see any other questions.
Great.
So I'm going to assume you are all taking it in. Please look forward to the recording. We will be including the contact information for Dave and Cornerstone Safety Group. So you will have that coming to you if you have further questions. I want to make one correction. I think I misspoke at the beginning of our webinar as well. For our Phoenix conference, we are doing Wilderness First Responder recertification. I think I said Wilderness First Aid. So just to clarify that, it is correct on the website, but I think I misspoke. Thank you all for being here. Awesome attendance. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your commitment to our association. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Karen and Aaron. Appreciate you both.
Thanks, Dave.